BBC 5 Live.
Welcome to the World Football Phone-In. A surprise substitution this week. I'm Nick Garnett. Doughton has done a bunk, but don't worry. The Legendino is here. Hello, Tim Vickery. How are you?
Very well. Good evening, Nick.
You're going to tell us all...
If you don't mind me just hijacking just at the start, I'd really like to dedicate the next 2 hours to the memory of Big Cyrille Regis. If you'll allow me just to outline that a little bit. And we were talking last week about times in football that were really important to you, and my answer to that was 86, and particularly the 86 World Cup. I think we were about the same age, Nick. If you remember, music in the early 80s was really exciting, and I've drifted out of football a little bit. I still was interested, but I drifted out a little bit, and it was the 86 World Cup that just got me absolutely obsessed again. I was at college at the time. I'd never been outside England. I'd never even been further north than Birmingham, so I wasn't well travelled. But being at college and watching the 86 World Cup in a cosmopolitan environment full of people from all around the country and all over the world, it just made me fall in love with football, and I think it led to me making a living from the game. So after that World Cup, I thought, I've got to get into a stadium. I've got to get me fix now. And it just so happened, I was at college in Coventry, and it just so happened that year, which was my final year at college, was the 86-87 season, where Coventry ended up having the greatest season in their history, winning the cup. And the big idol of the team was Big Cyrille Regis. So, I was watching him every week, and I was fascinated with this because, that generation of players, the racism they had to put up with was astonishing. It was extraordinary, the level of hatred that they had to put up with. And you could see, certainly as far as Coventry City fans were concerned, Big Cyrille was winning the battle. The sons of racists idolised him, and he just seemed to give off an innate nobility. It always reminded me at the time a little bit of kind of Bobby Moore. The way that Bobby Moore, there was just some kind of nobility that he managed to transmit. And with Cyrille Regis, I think in more difficult circumstances for that generation, that first really pioneering generation of black players, that innate nobility that he transmitted was really special, and it just made you fall in love with him. And I think people have seen the response to his tragically premature passing this week. The love that people had for Big Cyrille was one with the way that he behaved himself on the field, that innate nobility that he transmitted. So R.I.P. Big Cyrille, these 2 hours are for you. Right. Now,
joining us as well for football in Europe is Paul Sarahs. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Morning, yes,
now, listen,
not too bad.
Before we talk to you, I just want to bring in David Law, who's over at the tennis in Melbourne at the moment. Big West Brom fan. And you too, you're gutted at what's happened, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hard week, to be honest, to hear the news. Obviously, first of all, the fact that he was only 59 years of age when he lost his life, and from everybody I speak to, he was in great health, it seemed. He looked incredibly fit and strong still. He looked like, frankly, he could still lead the line at West Bromwich Albion better than any of our current players. Not saying a huge amount, but I mean, he was my first hero, and he will always be my hero, to be honest. He was leading the line at Albion when I was 8 years old and had a season ticket for the first time in 1981-82, and it was the year that he scored the match of the day goal of the season against Norwich. It's a goal that's been replayed on social media and on various channels all week long. I have to say, personally, I've not really been able to read any of the tributes to him to this point, because I find it a little bit too upsetting, to be honest, because he meant an awful lot to a lot of people, not just fans like me who just loved watching him play, and the spectacular way he went about his business and the decency which he seemed to carry himself with on the football field, but also just what he meant to generations of people, particularly black players who followed in his footsteps. In the words of Dion Dublin, stood on his shoulders. And there have been so many wonderful tributes to him, and I'm really pleased that has been the case. He was an incredible footballer as a striker. I've still, to this day, never seen anybody with the pace and power that he had. He was just an awesome force on the field. And I think the one other thing I would say is, coming from the West Midlands, I'm born there and I live there now, he is the only footballer that I've ever known that has been universally loved across that region. He played for Wolverhampton Wanderers, he played for Aston Villa, he played for West Bromwich Albion. Those teams do not like each other, and when he came back with those teams and with Coventry as well, he was given standing ovations with each one.
I mean, when you look at, I'm just looking through some of the things that he did. A BBC Sport poll put him as West Brom's all-time cult hero. He gained 65% of the vote, named as one of West Brom's 16 greatest players. Also, as you say, the Coventry City London Supporters Club Player of the Year. He was universally liked. I don't know if you've heard that the Premier League has decided, rightly so, that there's going to be a minute's applause. Everyone's going to be wearing black armbands later on today. It's the right way to remember him, isn't it?
It is the right way. I'm slightly sad that it's taken the outcry of many of my colleagues in the media and all of my fellow fans and football fans around the country to basically highlight the fact that they weren't going to do that for them to do it. But still, sense has been seen, and frankly, I think it's the least that they can do, and it's a great opportunity for everybody to just spare a minute and think about what this guy was like and what he brought. And there'll be a lot of very emotional people when that takes place, and a huge outpouring of emotion, and I'll certainly be amongst those.
Tim.
Yeah, and the word that was used there by Mr. Law, the lawmaker, hero, that's what he was, wasn't it? That's what he was, that's what he transmitted. So how good. I had the honour to be able to talk about him today on Brazilian TV, to explain who he was and why he was important. So I'm delighted that he will receive a tribute at Premiership grounds all around the country. How
did you go about that? How did you introduce a player who played relatively in the mind of football relatively long time ago? How did you talk to him? Talk to Brazilian TV about that?
It was in the context of a discussion about the way that players are criticised these days. They earn much more money these days than they did then, which is not their fault, but also that they are products of perhaps a more individualistic age. The young players today, so that they're criticised, and I was making a comparison, I suppose, if you like, with the more collective values because with Big Cyrille, it was clear that he was not only representing himself, he was representing the Afro-Caribbean community in our country, and that kind of collective awareness, I think, was very, very strong in him. And today's generation are perhaps more individualistic. So it was in the context of is Neymar hated? Because there are lots of people. We had a discussion on Brazilian TV, and someone were people sending in on social media that Neymar, for example, is an example of the worst type of humanity, which seems to be a level of hatred out of all proportion to any character defects that he may have. So that was the context, a discussion on how today's players are often envied and hated, sometimes nothing to do with their fault, but they perhaps do embody individualistic values where Big Cyrile's generation were more collective.
Paul Sarahs, now listen, this is a player who played for British teams. And you are younger than the rest of us, perhaps. What did you know about him? How did you remember him?
Well, I mean, as Tim said, it was a very formative time in Tim's footballing life, the mid-'80s, the '86 World Cup, and it was for me too. I was very young, but I remember, watching the '86 World Cup with my dad and being completely enamoured by everything about it. And then, of course, the FA Cup final. Again, that Tim mentioned in '87, of which Cyrille Regis was the star man of that team at the time. I was lucky enough to travel the country with my dad when I was a kid watching football, and I remember maybe slightly differently to others through the eyes of a naive child, but I remember there being an edgy atmosphere at many football grounds around the country still, in the mid to late 80s. And I remember vividly that black players were treated very, very differently. And I didn't understand the gravity of it at the time, the seriousness of it at the time. But, looking back with slightly more world-weary eyes at this time of my life, you realise, and of course, reading about Cyrile's life and his career and about football at that time in England, the thing that strikes me more even than his ability on the football pitch was the incredible grace with which he carried himself in the face of incredible racism at football grounds around the country. And, it speaks a great deal. It speaks volumes about the man. And I think that in football we tend to often we forget about the man when we talk about the player. But occasionally players come along and they're remembered for being, brilliant players, but also brilliant men. And I think it's not hyperbole to say that he was a brilliant man, and you only have to look at the outpouring, the collective outpouring of grief over the last few days to realise what a great man he was. But on the football pitch, I was speaking to my dad about it today actually, and he said he had all of the great attributes of Harry Kane at the moment for the younger listeners, but also the physical handful that maybe an Andy Carroll is. So he was quite the footballer, but more than that, I think he was the incredible grace with which he dealt with what life threw at him, particularly in the late 70s and the early 80s, that sets him apart from the vast majority of us that would not be able to deal with it in such a way. So it's a huge loss, I think, to football. But his legacy is assured. His legacy, we've seen it from Jason Roberts, who's his nephew, the emotional outpouring this week. Dion Dublin was in tears on BBC television. And what you said was correct. Dion Dublin said we stood on his shoulders. He blazed a trail, in an environment, in a country at the time that wasn't particularly welcoming. I think that's an understatement, but such grace and such a great player, and it's a real loss.
Now, if you're listening at home at the moment, you'll be hearing balls being bounced around in the background and cheering. That's because David Law is at Melbourne for the Australian Open and a big West Brom fan. Now, just bringing you back in here, you wanted to tell me something, didn't you?
Yeah, just a personal anecdote. I mean, I've worked in tennis now for 20 years, and you're around some pretty big star names like Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal and people like that. And incidentally, Simona Halep, just to say, is serving for the match now against Lauren Davis. She was set down, the world number one. But just an idea of what, to me, a hero, when you have a hero as a kid, does. I think the only person that I've ever asked for an autograph was Cyrille Regis. I've never been really interested in autographs and things like that. But as a 24-year-old, supposedly grown-up, I found out that he was doing a book signing. I'd never met him before. He'd always been my hero. And I decided to go along to this bookshop and try and get this book signed by him and just have a chance to meet him. And I queued up for about 2 hours. There was, there must have been 150, again, supposedly grown-ups standing there with their books out, waiting to meet Cyrille Regis. And I mean, I'm now a man of 6 feet 7 inches tall, so I towered above Cyrille Regis, who, in the words of Tim, is Big Cyril, and that's how I always used to know him. And I stood there and I got to the front, and I mean, I could barely speak to the guy. I was so starstruck, and he looked at me and he just said, "Crikey, I wouldn't have won many headers against you." And I said, "You would. I assure you would." And I mean, he couldn't have been nicer. He put me at ease. He just seemed like a lovely man. And I know so many people who know him way better than that very small little anecdote will tell you. I've never heard a bad word said about him. I really haven't. And you know, it's great to at least hear and see what he meant to so many people. It really is.
Well, let's bring in John, who's given me a ring from Stockport. I should run through the phone numbers just in case you haven't got those. 08085 909 693. Calls are free, of course, and you can text us on 85058, or the email is upallnight@bbc.co.uk. But John in Stockport, you've given us a ring about Cyrille Regis.
Certainly have, yeah. Good evening, also good morning, I should say. Basically, what it was, yesterday, that being Friday, obviously, I was going through text on BBC, obviously through my remote, and I picked up on the football headlines that there was going to be a minute's applause at all Premier League matches over the weekend in respect of with the great Cyrille Regis, yeah. And it was saying he was a trailblazer and a pioneer for black footballers. And what mystified me reading that was the fact that I thought, well, is it only going to be the Premier League? So what I did was I got in touch with Director Inquiries, one of the 118 numbers, managed to get the number for the Professional Footballers Association, which was given to me as an 020 number. Spoke to somebody on that number. I was then given the number for the PFA in Manchester.
And what did you manage to get?
I managed to find out, speaking to a lady who had to go and make inquiries, that thankfully it is actually going to be a minute's applause in the EFL as well.
So all Championship and through the divisions are going to honour him as well.
Yeah, she said to me if I wanted to take it further for non-league, I'd have to get in touch with the relevant non-league sponsors, you know, Vanarama, etc.
John, why? Said, can I just ask, why was he important to you?
Well, just basically because, as a lot of people have said, trailblazer for black footballers. And I remember watching the goal that's been shown quite a lot since Monday, since his passing. And just the fact that it was unfortunate at the time he was playing that a lot of nasty words were being bandied about, against black players by people who probably wouldn't realise that maybe in the past they could have had black players playing for their club, or how they would react in 2 years hence, should a black player join their club, because people's attitudes would have probably changed in that respect, It was just, to me, he just seemed to be a typical very nice gentleman who played the game in the right spirit,
John, thanks for your call.
Along with other, obviously, they mentioned the 3 degrees, Brendan Batson, was it? And was the other one
Laurie Cunningham?
Yeah.
Laurie Cunningham, sorry.
Well, this is actually this is the point that I want to go on to now, and I want to read an email from Tim in Coventry. Thanks for getting in touch. I'll read it all because it's an important one, and it's a question to both of you. This past week, we witnessed the sad passing of Cyrille Regis, formerly West Brom and Coventry, amongst many other clubs. He'll be remembered by many as a player who, when in the 1980s faced with some dreadful racial abuse, won the respect of all by answering with his deadly effectiveness in front of goal. Are there any other players in the panellists' regions who've had a similar impact on the game in their countries?
Well, yeah, the racial component, I think, is a little bit different in South America, because in England you're dealing with a situation of immigration. And this year we're celebrating 70 years of the Windrush boat arriving from Jamaica. There was a black presence in England before then, but it was relatively small, Tiger Bay or Liverpool or whatever. But this is mainly a story of post-war immigration and of immigrants looking for a place in society and feeling rejected by society. and of having to overcome all those barriers in society. The racism thing in South America, I think, is very different, because the black population, through enslavement, were here long before many of the European-based population. The millions who came out of Italy or Germany or Poland or Armenia or Lebanon. So it's a different situation a little bit. The situation of black players over here in South America, but certainly there have been. I mean, even Pelé. The way that Pelé conducted himself, and Pelé, his health is perhaps not quite as bad as has been reported in the last few hours. It looks like his spokesperson is adamant that he hasn't gone to hospital. He just needs to rest. But even on Pelé, with an absolute glorious lack of humility. No humility whatsoever, and this was apparent in him right from the start. One of Brazil's leading football writers even was writing about him at the age of 16 and 17 and saying the great thing about Pelé is he has no humility. You ask him who is the best in any position, and he will say, you know what, I am, and you need a little bit of swagger and a little bit of arrogance if you're going to look the world right in the eye and walk tall. And Pelé certainly did that. So hopefully he will recover from. He's had prostate problems and kidney problems. He's walking. He's Zimmer frame. He's not looking 100%. But hopefully he will make a full recovery and enjoy many more years of fruitful life, because for all the pleasure that he gave, he certainly deserves it.
Paul, anyone in Europe that springs to mind?
Yeah, well, I think it's a different era, isn't it now? And from what was faced back then by I don't like to use the nickname. It shows really the insensitivity of the time, the 3 degrees at West Brom. But
yeah.
one that sticks out. I mean, it's a term of endearment, really, but it shows the ignorance that ran through society at that time, that it was even considered as a nickname, let alone a term of endearment. But one that sticks out for me in European football is Emmanuel Olisadebe, who was born in Nigeria but played his international football in the just after the turn of the millennium with Poland. He was a naturalized Pole and played for the Polish national team. He was subject to horrendous abuse when he played for Polonia of Warsaw between 97 and the early 2000s. But by the end of his time playing for the Polish national team, it's amazing what a few goals can do. He was universally liked rather than abused. He was universally appreciated for his footballing exploits rather than roundly abused for what he was as a man. And it's heartwarming to hear, and it has been all week to see grown men, to hear grown men on the radio and on the television speak about another grown man as being their hero. We're not very predisposed to such talk, really, as men, I don't think. But this is the thing. This is what football does. Football is a force for good, really. And I've been in the same position as David Law. I've been lucky enough to meet many footballers that I looked up to when I was a kid, and guys that played for the football team that I support. And I've been in that situation too as a grown man, and it brings out the eternal child in you. I think football does, sport does.
And isn't it depressing that we only remember how great these people were when they've died? And that's the thing, that if we could only do something about that, we go on. Listen, John in Devon is on the phone. John, thanks for phoning in. What did you want to say about Cyrille Regis?
Yes, good morning, and I'm so glad that Tim wanted to dedicate part of his programme to the late Cyrille Regis. I am so pleased about that, because you've got so many listeners who will be too young today to remember him. He was absolutely brilliant. He was a very strong supporter of human rights and discrimination. He's an amazing guy, and I'm so sad to hear that he died this week. 59. He's a young man. I'm 73. I've been around a long time. And Cyrille, if you're listening to me now, I want you to listen to this. There's nothing wrong with being black. We sit at the front, you stand at the back. There is nothing wrong with being white. You're always wrong and we're always right. But say, if I was a green and you were a blue, would I like me and you like you? And could I accept you in such a horrible shade and you also of me, the color I made? Maybe I'm wrong. You should be orange and you should be purple. Because that way, you see, we complete the circle. We already have red in the Soviet bloc and the Chinese are yellow and there's a hell of a lot. But maybe, Cyrille, we've all lost our way because the wisdom of man looks for pale shades of grey. So before you look at the colour of skin, look deeper, my friend, to the soul that's within. There you are.
John, why did you write that?
Nice.
I wrote that when I was in the States. I'm 73. I lived in America when George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and I saw so much suffering. And I sat down over a pint of beer one night, and I quickly did that ditto in a space of about 15 minutes, and I've always remembered it. And it applies to so much in football today. Today is football day. There'll be guys going to the football today with bananas. Well, I wouldn't say they were doing that, but I think that's all stopped now. Hopefully it has. But there'll be jaunts and taunts on the touchline. I don't like it. There's no room for it in society. And it's not just football. It encapsulates so much about society. There's too much prejudice. And Tim, I'm so pleased that you want to dedicate on your opening salvo to this program to remember Cyrille Regis. I'm glad you did. Because as I just said, there were too many of us today who listen to this program would be too young to remember him. But he was a very strong supporter of the black football
and people
player.
in other countries as well, John. People in other countries who listen around the world who maybe won't know who he was because he was before the Premier League was a global concern. So it's a privilege and an honour to have this opportunity to explain who Cyrille Regis was to people all around the world.
Listen, thank you so much, all of you, for what you've had to say over the last half hour. It's right that we've spent that time talking about one of the greats, somebody who was so important to the game and has moved the game on from where it was to where it is now and where it will be in the future. Paul, it's the winter break at the moment, but the transfer window goes on apace.
It does indeed. Yeah, we've seen a few. Well, it's been a particularly quiet one, I think. There's the usual blather that goes along with the circus at this time of the year, Nick. But very few real deals. But one that's caught the eye today is Brighton have broken their transfer record, signing Jürgen Locadia from PSV, a striker, but slightly more than a striker, really. He's capable of playing on either side of a front three as well as through the middle. And I'm interested really to see how he does, because when you sign forwards from the Netherlands, from the Eredivisie, it tends to go one of two ways, and those two ways are at opposite ends of the extreme, really. For every Afonso Alves, I'm sure Tim's smirking away there in Rio, you get a Luis Suarez, and for every Van Nistelrooy, you get a Josie Altidore. So I'm interested to see how it goes, really, with Jürgen Locadia. He's an excellent player, very, very, very good player, a technical player. I'm not sure which way this one will go, really. He has all of the attributes to really succeed over here. So I'm sure Brighton fans are excited by his signing. They've certainly added some quality up front, but I suppose, as with all of them, time will tell.
In the three teams down at the bottom, or the three teams that came up last year in the Premier League, Brighton are really one of the first ones to actually make any moves, aren't they? And all three need to be looking at making some type of movement or doing something to try and improve their standing.
It's incredibly tight at the bottom. Between 18th placed Stoke and Everton in 9th, there's only 7 points separating them. So, it's absolutely crucial that if teams choose to bring players in January, that they are the right players. It's always the case, but you've got a bit of breathing room if you're sort of above, Leicester and above. But it's absolutely vital down at the bottom. And then, of course, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really, Nick, because you may spend millions, tens of millions, as is the case these days, and it may not be enough, and you may end up with very expensive white elephants as you make your way down to the Championship for next season. So January is always an important time, but particularly if you're one of those 11 clubs really that are still in the mire, as it were.
Bringing a player in from Europe is one thing in the close season, especially to a club that's not got that history of bringing in players from far away. But Tim, if you were to bring in a South American footballer into a club like Brighton or Newcastle or Huddersfield Town or any of the clubs in that bottom eight, I mean, is it going to work? Or do you really need to acclimatise someone for more than half a season before you're going to start getting results out of them?
Yeah, because if you're bringing them straight in from South America, one thing you have to factor in at this time of year is the climate difference.
Yeah.
When it's high summer over here at the moment. One young man who didn't seem to have any problems when he came over this time last year was Gabriel Jesus. Obviously, that's a different story, because he's going to Manchester City, a club, at the other end of the table, where as a striker, that's terrific, because you get chances and you get an opportunity there to get a goal or two and to build some confidence. I think it's harder if you're bringing someone straight in from South America without pre-season to bed them in to a side that's perhaps lacking in confidence at the wrong end of the table. I think then that the collective context makes things much, much harder for an unacclimatised player to hit the ground running.
A couple of years ago, I was moving house, and I'd moved out my house and didn't know whether to actually rent it or to sell it. And no one seemed to be wanting to buy it. And a football club, I'm not going to name which one it was, got in touch with the estate agent and said, we want to put someone in, we're going to make a signing, we want to put them in the house. Is there everything in there? In terms of, to the point where it was, have you got sugar and have you got salt in there and pepper and everything else? Literally, they were just going to drop someone into a house and expect them to be able to start in training the next day and then be able to move. There wasn't any, as you said, there wasn't the pre-season time to just bed somebody in.
But more then than there was like 15 years ago, because say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they'd have bought the player and not even worried about fixing up a house.
True.
They'd have dumped him in a hotel. So I think that the clubs. I remember doing an interview on here with Juan Pablo Angel who was signed by Aston Villa, talking about, because remember after he came over, now he's a highly educated man, upper middle class, spoke some English. And even when he came over, he found it very, very hard initially. His wife had a health problem, and he didn't get any support at all. And he was telling us that by the end of his time at Aston Villa, things had moved on a lot. There were club welfare officers, and there was more of a conception that the club hadn't just bought a footballer, it had bought a human being. But I'm sure there's still plenty of work that could be done.
We're going to go on with an email from Elliot in Birmingham. First-time emailer. Welcome to the programme. Says, can you ask you guys, what do you think the prospects in Europe are for Vinicius Junior? I'm hoping I pronounced that right. He's just signed a contract to join Real Madrid from Flamengo after his 18th birthday.
Yeah, and he was the star of the South American Under-17 Championships last year, and that's when Real Madrid picked him up, and they paid just an absolute fortune for him. For someone who at the time hadn't played a serious game. I was there for his debut for Flamengo, which was last May, and he was on the bench. And there was such fuss about it. The crowd, they couldn't wait to get him out there on the field, all because of this move and the hype around it, because you can't actually transfer him over until he's 18. So he's at Flamengo until he's 18. And he came on for the last 15 or 20 minutes. And it was just like a kind of ball boy who'd come on, quite a talented ball boy, but, he went through his repertoire of tricks and everything failed. So poor old Vinicius Junior, by the end of his little 15 minutes, the crowd were booing him. Well, we've seen much more of him since then, and there is talent there. And he's quick and he's direct, but he's in too much of a hurry. He's trying to do everything at 100 miles an hour at the moment. There have been the odd goal and the odd flash of promise. But to play well is to choose well. It's to choose the right option. And at the moment, he just seems to be in so much of a hurry about everything that he's doing that he's not taking good decisions. He's got a lot of maturing to do. And I do hope that the size of the transfer fee and the expectation that the transfer fee has generated don't hold him back, because it's such a young age at which to make a decisive judgment about a player. So much can happen to a player who's picked up at this age, at the age of, say, 17. And just an example that Premier League fans will remember, Anderson. Do you remember Anderson of Manchester United?
Yeah.
Who he's just had his contract ripped up by his Brazilian club this week, by Internacional. And I saw him at 17 playing for Brazil at under-17 level. He was the player of the tournament in the World Under-17 Cup. And he was astonishing. He had an acceleration like the Millennium Falcon out of Star Wars. And he could. It was a sustained pace that he had. And he was really special. Really special. He went to Portugal. He suffered a serious injury. And he was never the same player again, because he'd lost that injury had taken away his pace. So before he was 20, he already wasn't the same kind of player. Now, United bought him and made the best of a bad job and turned him into a central midfielder. And he was interesting. He had a good left foot, and for 2 or 3 years there, he looked like a very interesting central midfielder. But he was very, very rich, very young. There's a story that I heard about him today when he was 17 playing for Grêmio. And so we're going back now more than a decade. He had 3 mobile phones. His coach said, "What on earth do you need 3 mobile? How many years have you got, for crying out loud? What on earth do you need with 3 mobile phones?" But he was someone who became very rich without having done a great deal. And by the end of his time at United, he didn't seem, it didn't seem as if football was so much of a priority. So he went back to Brazil. Internacional, they spent a lot of money on him, were paying him a lot of money, and they've just got nothing from him, and they've just decided to rip up his contract. Had you made a judgment on him based on what he was at 17, it would have been a very different judgment from the player that he turned out to be. So I hope all the hype and all the brouhaha doesn't hold Vinicius Junior back. There is raw talent there, but he needs a lot of he needs a lot of moulding. And you think if he goes to Real Madrid at the age of 18, well, you can't imagine him getting a game or much of a game. He'll be loaned out here and loaned out there, which can work, but on the other hand, it can hold players back. When you're loaned out to clubs who don't have a long-term interest in you, suddenly you're no longer the apple of anyone's eye. That can have a bad effect on a career. So promise, but handle with care.
If you want to get in touch with us on the World Football Phone-In, the phone number is 0808 5909 693 0808 5909 693. Calls are free. Now, we've spoken so far about the things that are important, the transfer window. We've talked about Cyrille Regis. There's one subject, apart from Cyrille, of course, that's been really in the news over here, and Robert from Colchester has given me a ring. You want to talk to the guys about one thing and one thing only. What's the thing that's important to you?
VAR.
VAR.
Yes, the video referee. On Tuesday evening, we had pundits on television saying this is the greatest thing to happen recently in football because there was a goal awarded for the first time using the video ref. And then on Wednesday evening, there was all sorts of stuff going on in the Chelsea versus Norwich FA Cup tie, and Alan Shearer reckoned it was an absolute shambles. The thought that occurs to me is, even with this system, things will still be, refs will still make mistakes. I read an article in the week, a writer actually saying, well, players make mistakes as well, and so do managers. But I was just wondering, with our two pundits, how they think it might go, and what experience they perhaps have in their regions. I know from reading a BBC article that it seems to have gone down well in Italy, where it's been explained a lot to players, to managers, to fans. But in Germany, half the players that were surveyed by the Kicker magazine said, well, no, we don't think it's working well. So how is it? Is this sort of thing in your area, or that you know of in football and other sports? And do you think perhaps we do need to educate people so that it can be looked at better?
Tim?
Well, I've just had a chat. So, do you want to take this one first, Paul, and come back to me?
Yeah, I think the most striking thing to me is that it's obviously very important for the Football Association to be seen not to degrade the power of the referee. The referee ultimately has to have the final say on the pitch, and that means that if there is a decision that is open to interpretation, it is the referee that has to go to the VAR, which it seems inherently the wrong thing to me, because the referees make mistakes. Of course they do. It seems that some make more than others. Again, naturally, I think that is going to be the case. But if the ultimate decision is with the referee, then we're only. I mean, we saw a situation with Willian, who was clearly fouled in that FA Cup game, and it should have been a penalty for Chelsea. Now the referee didn't give the penalty, so he was sure that it wasn't a foul. And then, how is there going to be a situation where the referee is convinced that a decision has to be given one way, but then is going to second guess himself and go to a video assistant referee? It doesn't make much sense to me. I think that there should be, we see in American football that coaches have a red flag that they can throw, which is a challenge, a coach's challenge. I think, it's very early days for VAR. We've had very mixed results, as you said, across the continent. We've seen really controversial decisions, much fewer of those in Italian football. In German football, it doesn't seem to have made a huge amount of difference other than to really break up the game. I think that leaving ultimate power with one man is an issue. I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And, it just seems inherently the wrong thing to do, to allow the referee to still have ultimate power over whether a video is used by an assistant referee watching from the stands. I know in the NFL, everything is done, from a studio. Every decision is reviewed in a studio in New York, whether the game is in Philadelphia or LA or wherever it is. It goes to a VAR, not at the ground. I appreciate that it's a very different game. It's a much more stop-start kind of game, American football. So is rugby. So is, of course, cricket. So is tennis. The problem lies with the fact that football is a flowing game. Mistakes will still be made. And at the moment, we're seeing many mistakes that are easily resolved, I think, not in terms of the actual decision that is made, but it happens often with a break in play. Was it a penalty? Was it not? Was it mistaken identity? Was it not? We have a very, very narrow a number of issues that can be resolved using a video assistant referee, and I think there's a bedding in period also for the referees to get used to that technology. And it seemed to me that maybe the referee in the Norwich Chelsea match at Stamford Bridge midweek maybe momentarily forgot that option was there. And another thing that seems probably a bit wrong with it all is that we're now seeing players encouraging the referee to go to the video assistant, which, we can't. We've almost eradicated players gesticulating for an opponent to be, given a yellow card for a foul. That's punishable by a yellow card in itself. And I think that once it becomes, if we are to persist with this technology, which it seems as though we are, these initial issues will largely be ironed out, and it's such a new thing in football that it'll take some time to bed in. But certainly in England, the initial reaction is one of utter bewilderment, I think.
Tim.
Yeah, and we're clearly going to get teething troubles with it. And I think in the long term, the only way this is going to work is if you have a fixed team. If you have the same ref working with the same video ref, so they're working together. Otherwise, it's going to be a fruit salad with one point in one way and one point in the other way, and it's not going to work. It's also, and I think that there's a kind of nerdish generation who've grown up thinking technology can solve everything. We have to accept here that it's not going to solve everything, that so many decisions in football are questions of interpretation, not of fact. And even some that you think of a fact are really close to interpretation. For example, offside. Even the basic thing about the offside line, and anyone who works in TV will tell you that so much depends on the exact moments at which the VT operator stops the thing. in terms of who's offside and who. There are real marginal decisions there that even with technology we might not be able to get right. So let's agree that it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it will help in certain cases. It will help with certain cases and certain decisions. The worry for me is, now Paul's made the point there that football is all about rhythm. The worry for me is if you go down a road where you give coaches the right to challenge, then that will be used not necessarily in a quest for sporting justice, but in a quest to break up the rhythm of the game. Let's imagine last 10 minutes, your side is winning 1-0, you've got a certain amount of reviews left. You are going to use them just to stop the rhythm of the opposition, in the same way that now some substitutions are made purely and simply for that reason. And that stoppage, I think, would be undesirable. So I hope there's no question of giving the coaches the power to challenge decisions. I don't think it works in football. So it's here to stay. It is sometimes going to cause as many problems that it solves, but in the long term, I think it's probably a positive thing as long as we accept it's not going to be perfect.
Robert, what do you think should happen here? What have you thought about it?
Well, I think I would pick up on a number of the points that the two pundits have made. I think it's quite right. You won't solve everything. Sometimes the camera angle may not be right to actually make a decision. We've had that in cricket. That you can't necessarily see the critical piece of action. I think, take it gently. Bear in mind all the points that have been raised, and also recognise that there is a limited number of situations where perhaps it can be applied. And I quite agree, there is the flow to football. It is often a question of interpretation, and we have to accept that there's no perfect answer. There seem to be lots going on in that Norwich-Chelsea match, and if you haven't got simulation on your agenda for tonight, I think that could probably do half a programme because there was so much going on there. But thank you very much for discussing my question.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting, isn't it? We thought that VAR was going to be the end of it. We thought that was going to be the thing that gave us the solution, and it's just opening up so many more things and so many more questions. I've got a lot of emails on, and I've also got Owen in Oregon who's on the line, who's given us a ring. Owen, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Everyone? We're all absolutely fine. Tell us what your point is.
So the Confederation of Independent Football Associations are having a World Cup in London this June, I believe, and there's some controversial teams like Northern Cyprus and Tibet competing. I was just wondering, for Tim, is there any South American countries with secessionist movements who might be interested in this? And Catalonia, they want to secede from Spain. Maybe this would be a way that they could get some international recognition in future if they join this Confederation of Independent Football Associations.
Yeah, I can't really think of the only one I could imagine conceivably with a separation type movement would be Brazil, and there are certain parts of the south of Brazil who I think they do grumble a little bit about. They think that they're the ones who pay for the largesse and the corruption that goes on further north. But I'm realising that the history of Brazil is extraordinary in terms of promoting a national unity in a country which is now 27 states, and that idea of a kind of a separatist movement is it's there, but very, very faintly indeed. So nothing like the situation in Europe. And I hadn't even heard about this World Cup, which perhaps Paul will have much more to say about than I do.
Yeah, well, it takes place. It's actually taking place in London this year, at the end of May, beginning of June, and this is one, I think, where European football almost sort of comes into its own. The vast majority of the members of CONIFA, it's called, are very interesting parts of Europe. So Ellen Vannin, the Isle of Man, are part of it, and Greenland, which of course is a Danish dependency, is another. Northern Cyprus. Yorkshire, I think, have entered qualifying.
Brilliant.
Which isn't it funny how within 30 seconds of meeting anyone from Yorkshire, you know exactly where they're from. So I mean, I'll be honest, it's not something I've become aware of it over the last few months because it's being hosted over here, and I mean, it's very interesting, and there's a lot to be said. I think that FIFA is not the be all and end all of football in the world, and the individual confederations, I think, with the scandals that have been going on over the last few years, particularly, I think that's enough to turn people off a lot of the time from established football. And we've got an opportunity now, I suppose, to support those not nations, but certainly areas of the world with real identities, unique identities, to support them in their endeavours to play football. And we've had a situation. I mean, Spain is the perfect example, really. Spain is almost a myth. There are so many different peoples and different languages and different cultures within the nation of Spain that Spain as a single entity, as a nation of itself, is almost a bit of a fallacy. I mean, you look within Spain, you have from west to east across the north, you have Galicia, which is they speak Gallego, which is a combination almost of Spanish and Portuguese. Then you have Asturias. Asturiana is a dialect of its own. You have the Basque Country with Euskera, and then further along you have Catalonia, and then down the eastern coast, the Mediterranean coast, you have Valenciana, and then you have the islands. Mallorquin is a dialect of its own, and for these areas that are often lumped together with others that they've had historical conflicts with, is nice to celebrate the diversity. And we have FC Barcelona being the dominant force, of course, in European football, the pioneers of the new football, I suppose, in the last decade or more. And if you look at the footballing histories of some of their players, you will see that not only have they represented Spain and won World Cups, but they're also very keen to represent Catalonia in their non-official, non-accredited by FIFA or UEFA friendly matches, and the same in the Basque Country too. So it's a different kind of football, but it's an opportunity for people to take a real pride in their region without almost being obliged to support the enemy, I suppose. And I guess the argument around, I'm sure you remember Team GB at the Olympic Games in London, and various constituent parts of the United Kingdom did not want to release their players to play for Team GB. It was left in the end as individuals to make their own decisions on it. And one of the fears was that it would lead to an amalgamation of the constituent football associations within the UK going forward, and nobody wanted that. They didn't want to be stripped of their national footballing identity, and the Isle of Man don't have that option. So I mean, they do in the Commonwealth Games, which is interesting, I think. But I'll certainly be following it, and unfortunately coincides, or at least is very close to the FIFA World Cup this coming summer. But I will be there.
Who cares?
I think it's great. Darfur and Somaliland and Western Sahara and Zanzibar and Quebec. That Quebec, the Quebecois, fiercely nationalist.
Right, this is to both of you. This is from Satjinder here, who says, I remember watching Colombia destroy Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires during the World Cup qualifying with cracking goals from Asprilla and Rincon, and thought they were contenders for the 1994 World Cup. However, they crashed out at the group stage, and tragically the death of Andres Escobar when he returned home cast a long shadow on Colombian football. Can I ask Tim, first of all, what happened in between that 5-0 thrashing and the World Cup? Did they believe their own hype?
Yes, they did. Even Pelé came out and said that Colombia are amongst the favourites. which was kind of the kiss of death. And they did swan around, and they swanned around like they were Pretty Boy Floyd. So, but if you look at their record outside the World Cup, they could beat anyone. The World Cup brings pressures of its own. They actually played really, really well in their first game, which was against Romania. But they ran into George Hagi, who did them, and they lost 3-1. But it's a game that they could have won. There's one vital thing missing from that Colombian side, and that was a goalkeeper, René Higuita. Higuita was a truly great goalkeeper and a real pioneer, I think, of the way that many goalkeepers play these days, in that Higuita would take responsibility for things 30, 40 metres from goal. All right, it went badly wrong in one decisive moment against Roger Miller in 1990. But all the times that it went right, what that meant was that Colombia's back four could play higher up the field, and it meant that they could keep close together. They could keep the lines of the team close together, like 10 metres apart, which for a team that played a hypnotic short passing rhythm, if you have the lines of your team close together, that makes it easier to play those short passes and keep possession of the ball and wear the opposition down. When they won that game 5-0 against Argentina, they didn't have Higuita then either, but it didn't matter so much because they were playing that one much more on the counter-attack, with Argentina coming at them and Colombia able to launch on the counter-attack. In the World Cup, it's Colombia who are playing in the opposing half of the field. So that goalkeeper coming out and taking responsibility was very important. Now, Higuita wasn't available for that World Cup on grounds that the Colombian state now realises were wrong. Higuita was in prison. Now, Colombia was going through a very, very bad time, a really bad time. It was Locombia, the crazy country at the time, with, as well as the power of the drug cartels, lots of kidnappings going on. And someone had been kidnapped, and Higuita was brought in as a kind of middleman to help with the negotiations. And he's a kid from the barrio, knows some of the people involved, and he helped out, and he got a payment for it. Now, it's illegal to profit from kidnapping. So because he'd received some money from helping out in this situation, he was put in jail, which was a historic injustice. And it was absolutely terrible for the Colombian side. Firstly, they lost someone who spread confidence throughout the team. And the moment when the Colombian side, that great Colombian side, came of age, they will say this themselves, was a game they played at Wembley in 1987 or 88. When, Wembley, that's a famous name to the South Americans. First time Colombia had ever played there. And what's René Higuita doing? He's wandering around as if it's just a kick around in his back garden. Puts confidence through the rest of the team. That would have been so important during the World Cup. But also, the goalkeeper they had, Oscar Cordoba, was a very competent goalkeeper, but absolutely useless to that role of playing 40 metres from goal. He couldn't do it. He didn't know how to do it. And Hagi took advantage of this to lob him. So I think that was absolutely key. And then once they've lost the first game, the pressure really starts ramping up, because you've got one drug cartel betting in favour of them, one drug cartel betting against them. The death threats start coming through. They'd had death threats even before they qualified for the World Cup in 1990, so that this was nothing new. But being there at the World Cup, it just made the whole thing much bigger and much more visible. And the players themselves, they said for their second game, the vital second game, when they took the field against the United States, when the national anthem is being played, they're looking around the crowd thinking, I wonder if someone's going to shoot us. So in the end, I think being the representatives of a country which was falling apart was too much for them. That's something which in football terms I bitterly regret, because they were a truly great side who, for partly for psychological reasons and partly for the loss of Higuita, and at the world stage they weren't able to show themselves and do anything like justice to the wonderful ability that they had.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so I want another email that's come in now for both of you, this one, from Fode in Brooklyn, in New York, who's emailed us. This is a good one. Breaking news, Ronaldinho has just announced his retirement. Do you think we judge him harshly because of what we think he could have achieved so much more with his talent? I think Messi and Ronaldo have spoilt it for everyone because they have been consistently good for such a long time, which is really not the norm. We've not seen such Ronaldinho-type skills in football until now, perhaps with Neymar. He goes on to say, great work, everyone, and then adds this, Dotton, you really are the best presenter. Thanks so much for that. Anyway, so there we are. Ronaldinho, the lost talent, and Messi and Ronaldo as the epitome of actually performing at the height of their skills. What do you think?
Well, I think.
I'll take it first, Paul.
I think there's going to be maybe a slight clash here between Tim and I, because I think Ronaldinho is not the best player that ever lived, but he's certainly my favourite. And I read with interest something that Tim wrote this week about the retirement of Ronaldinho, who, let's not forget, hasn't kicked a ball in a couple of years, and arguably retired at the age of 27 or 28. From the heights that he reached before that. I think that I mean, it's a bit of a tired old cliche, but the joy with which he played the game elevated him above and beyond the mere mortals that surrounded him. But I think that he probably lost that to an extent, and with it, he lost a bit of that magic. If you could have given him the work rate of Messi, the desire to be the best of Cristiano, then I don't think there would be any doubt that Ronaldinho would be the greatest that ever kicked a ball. And he's not in that debate purely because of that. In terms of pure outrageous talent, there are very, very few, if any, that can come anywhere near him. But I can tell you this, from a personal perspective, I've never enjoyed watching a footballer more in my life, in my almost 40 years. I've never enjoyed watching a footballer more than Ronaldinho. And the things that he could do, I mean, there's an argument that says that Lionel Messi does everything that you've seen before, but he does it with such unerring consistency that he has become the greatest that the game has ever seen. But Ronaldinho did things that you'd never seen before, and you've only really begun to see again in Neymar, who I think is probably a great example of the middle ground. He works incredibly hard, Neymar, and he also has that incredible talent that Ronaldinho had. I know that Tim loves Ronaldinho. I know he does, but also maybe like a wayward son who wasted his talent to a certain degree. Tim's a little sterner with Ronaldinho than I think the rest of us are.
But there's a reason for that, Paul, and I go along with everything you said. I think it was a wonderfully phrased question that we had there from Brooklyn. But the reason that I'd be more down on him than you are, and I agree, and no one has given as much pleasure as Ronaldinho did it, an absolute genius. But I've seen more of him going down, because he came back to Brazil and played here for years, and there you saw the cynical side of it, and it's a story of contradictions, because on Ronaldinho, when he was at his best, it was just the purity of football. It's the thing that reminded you of why we all fell in love with the game in the first place. He played football in a full meaning of the verb play. That he's enjoying himself, he's expressing himself, he's recreating himself, and he's allowing us all to share in the experience. So there was such purity in that. However, the other side of the hill, once he decided that he would rather party than be a serious footballer, he would betray his talents, and he wouldn't do himself justice. Now, I've got no problems with that as long as you retire. But he didn't. He went on getting paid an absolute fortune, really on kind of false pretenses. I remember when he came back to Flamengo, someone who played with him at Barcelona was asked, well, how do you think it's going to go? And the answer was, well, he'll be all right as long as he gets more than 1 hour's sleep a night. That's someone who knew him fairly well and knew what he was getting up to. How can you betray your talent like that? It's the only thing in life that he is a genius at. Just that. That's got a time. That's got a time limit. You can do it up to the age of 35, 37, 38, perhaps. Then you can't do it anymore. You've got the whole of the rest of your life to do other things. So I wouldn't have a problem. I'd have less of a problem with him if he had just retired at 28, but he wanted the money. So he would still go on and get paid, but he wouldn't get himself fit. And it became quite cynical in the end. And even this retirement thing is a little bit cynical. I was in the stadium for his last game, which is more than 2 years ago now, September 2015. He was taken off at half-time. It was just pitiful and really sad to watch. So, they've tried to find another contract. They haven't found another sucker. That's basically what it comes down to. So now they're organising a kind of farewell tour. So this is a commercial thing as well. It's all right, we don't really want to do the hard work, but we want the money, please, which I think is a little bit depressing. I remember interviewing him in 2000 when he was just so enthusiastic and bright-eyed, and he was clearly in love with the game. And somewhere along the line, he lost that love. So I absolutely adored him when he was at his best, and those memories will never, ever go away. But, all right, if you've decided that you've fallen out of love with it, if you don't really want to do it professionally, give up, rather than play on for 10 years getting money under effectively false pretences.
His big mistake really was not going and watching Blade Runner with that quote that the flame that burns twice as bright burns for half the length of time, something like that. We've got nearly a dozen emails to get through in 25 minutes, so we're going to crack on with as many as we can. This one from James in Didsbury in Manchester. Question for both of you. What's the role of futsal in each expert's regions? It's one of the fastest growing sports in the UK. Do any countries in your regions have full-time professional leagues? And it says here, hopefully we can move on past the terrible pie jokes from last week. Thank you, James. Off you go, guys. Probably Paul first for this one.
Yeah, well, we are late, very, very late to the party, really, in terms of futsal in the UK. It's a very young sport here, probably why it's one of the fastest growing sports in the UK. But it's well established in UEFA countries all over the continent, from Albania all the way through to Ukraine. They have professional leagues now. The winners of the Futsal World Cup over the last few years would probably surprise many. I think obviously the South American countries are strong, but also Eastern European countries are pretty strong. Russia, Ukraine, nations like that tend to do well, and as a gateway into, or even as a supplementary sport to 11-a-side football, it's fantastic for teaching those things that have been lost, really, certainly in the academy system in the UK. How to play football. The ball is slightly heavier, doesn't bounce as much. It's about close control and about making the right decisions in tight spaces. It's almost like a five-a-side, kind of game, but even different from that. There's much more emphasis on your touch, on your ability to make the correct decision in a smaller field of play, and also with much less time on the ball. So in terms of developing those skills, the skills that we in Britain have traditionally lagged behind on, it's a fantastic tool for creating footballers rather than athletes.
Tim,
it's very big over here and has been big over here for longer. I go along with what Paul said about the value of small-sided games and a lot of contact with the ball, and that's clear and obvious. There are some people who hold it up as, especially Brazil's, big secret. I wouldn't go that far. I would put it in more of a context where I think more than anything else, what the role that futsal has played has been a kind of retreat from old-fashioned street park wasteland football, and as real estate speculation has swallowed up a lot of the old urban spaces where you used to play football, and especially as urban violence has made the remaining spaces dangerous. There's been a tendency to get the kids off the street and get them into a sanitised, safe, controlled environment of futsal. I wonder if something may have been lost in this transition. I'm a bit old school on this. I think that the greatest forming ground of footballers known to mankind is the old informal kickabout, where you're working out your own solutions. But there's no doubt that in a context of real estate speculation and urban violence, futsal plays an important role over here.
Okay, On to the next email, because I love this one. This is from Martin, who's got in touch with us and says, I have a question for both of you. With the relative underwhelming performances of big transfers from Dortmund, do both pundits think that there are clubs that artificially boost the worth of a player due to the setup of the team and the tactics? And are there any other teams in your regions that buying clubs should be wary of when looking at players from them?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we spoke about Jürgen Locadia early on, and he's one of the headlines in the sports news as well. We see lots of players come from the Netherlands to England to play their football, and I mentioned it when speaking about Locadia that certain players have come on the back of excellent seasons, normally attacking players. And they have struggled desperately, or they've overachieved over there, and their real level has been found out over here. And I think part of that is because of the Dutch system, which has given the game so much over the last 40 years. You tend to come through the system at Ajax or PSV or Feyenoord, and through under sixes all the way up to the first team. There's a homogenization of tactics. You know your role. You play within that system, and I think in last season or the season before, 16 of the 18 Eredivisie teams played a very Dutch 4-3-3, and it's very difficult to take that education. It's the only education that many players have ever known, and to try and adapt your game to a completely different set of tactics, and very often with the short-termism that we see in European football, particularly in English football, you may be playing one system, for one half of the season, and then things aren't going well. The manager's sacked, the entire backroom team go with him, and you have an entire new system to learn. And we've seen that, I think, not only with players, but also with coaches. And Frank de Boer with his time at Crystal Palace, and before that with Inter. He was incredibly successful with Ajax. He won 5 league titles in a row, first time it had ever been done, I think, in the Eredivisie era in the Netherlands, and went to Inter, tried to implement a similar kind of system, brought players with him, as he did indeed at Crystal Palace at the beginning of the season, and fell flat on his face. And it is difficult. I mean, look, Dortmund are the best in terms of buying players in at the age, under the age of 21 years old, and in terms of turning those players around and making the biggest profits. Other teams tend to develop players from a much younger age. The Benficas, Porto tend to buy players in from South America, which is a well-trodden path between South America and Europe, and then they make their profits that way. But Dortmund are the best at increasing a player's value. Gundogan and Dembele in recent years, and Goetze, who went to Bayern Munich and didn't do particularly well and went back to Dortmund. And, many other players. Aubameyang is maybe another who, during this transfer window, may be moving on to Arsenal or to Chinese football. So I don't know if it's about artificially boosting your players' worth. I think that players fit systems. Players are given more opportunity and longer, generally, at clubs like Dortmund to prove their worth, whereas they're expected here, after a big money move, to hit the ground running. And there are many factors that come into a transfer being successful or otherwise, and football is just one of those things. It's a culture shock for many, the language barrier, the expectations, the English clubs are the richest clubs in the world, and you will buy a player may go to Spain or to Italy or to elsewhere for 10 or 15 million. I think you can look at adding 30 or 40% to an English club. And we've got a situation now where with Everton, they've just bought a player from Turkey, Cenk Tosun, and he's gone for 20 odd million pounds, where he raised in Germany. If he'd gone to a German club, he may have gone for 12 or 15 million. And I think that the fee goes a long way to raising expectation levels, and the hype that we've seen around Cenk Tosun is, he's never going to be a success. He's never going to reach that level of hype. So I think some of it is probably down to the media and the hype that is built around big money transfers. And again, it's just a poor fit more often than not, with players coming into playing in a league and often systems that they are not, particularly knowledgeable of.
Right, it's 3:45. Still got a few more minutes left. And I want to bring in Casey, who's on the line from Chicago. Casey, what's your point?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to say one thing I thought really interesting is that, Cyrille Regis passed on the 14th, which is actually the day before Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday in the States. It's a national holiday. And I think that it's a really good time to with the state of affairs globally, to really take time to think about these people that fought for civil rights in their own way in the past, and even think about some of the people that are involved now. And even think about people like Mario Balotelli and Salim Montari, who both had issues on the pitch with racism, that it's not something that's gone away. So I just think that's something really good to focus on, especially this week with everything that's happened. But my question was for Paul. I was wondering about João Mario. I'm a West Ham supporter, and there are rumors that he could come on loan to us, and I just wondered what you thought about that and how you could see him possibly fitting in.
Yeah, well, I believe we were talking about Frank de Boer just now, and I think he joined Inter when Frank de Boer had just been given the job in Milan at Inter, and it's not really worked out for him. He was wonderful at Sporting, played at every youth and under 21 and full international with Portugal. I think, again, January is not the best time to try and incorporate players into your team, particularly from foreign climes. And the caliber of player that Moyes and West Ham have been linked with, may be slightly underwhelming for many West Ham supporters. But the likes of Harry Arter and one or two others who've played in the Premier League in recent seasons. But I think this is probably the wisest move at the moment for West Ham, purely because you've got much more of an opportunity to see those players hit the ground running. They know the league, they know the culture. And West Ham are only 4 or 5 points clear of the relegation zone. So I think that there has to be an element. And I think probably Theo Walcott to Everton is another one of those. £20 million for a Premier League proven player. It seems like very, very good business. Whereas trying to take as much of the risk out of the transfer as you can. I think it's intrinsic to a player's ability to adapt to a new league, to have a full pre-season behind them, which is why I think Pep Guardiola is looking at making signings in January. Players like Fregi of Shakhtar to come in the summer. I think the value of a pre-season is not just about fitness. It's not just about learning tactics. It's about acclimatizing to a new culture, to a new club, to a new life, a new lifestyle. Don't forget, these guys are going to be signing 4 and 5 year deals. João Mario is a fine player. He's not really lived up to expectations at Inter. I think it's been a time of real change over the last 3 years at Inter, or 2 years since João Mario got there. Who knows, it may be the lease of life that he needs. I mean, his quality is, you can't really argue with his quality, whether it's the right signing now on loan, less risk with a loan signing, obviously. But what if he comes in, does very, very well in the final 20 games of the season, and then one of the bigger clubs in England takes a fancy and comes in? So I'm not sure that he's the right kind of player at the moment to give West Ham what they need. But I think West Ham, again, I mean, how do you turn down an opportunity to sign a player of that quality? It's a difficult one, but January always is difficult in terms of finding not only the right kind of player, but the right kind of player that's available. That's the thing. And you're looking at paying a premium, so a loan deal is the smartest move of all. And I mean, the latest update that I've read is that he's not particularly interested. So, I mean, we'll see. I think West Ham will have enough to stay up, and then under Moyes they can look to rebuild in the summer, a more measured approach to it.
I want to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, and it's really got people interested, and that's video assisted refereeing. So the first email is from Dennis. I'll read out a few things, and then you can have a chat about them. Dennis in Grantham says, earlier you talked about VAR and the refereeing decisions. Are referees around the world getting as much stick and scrutiny? Do the panel think the quality of referees in their areas are above or below those in the Premier League? Now, I have an idea, he says. How about a league of referees with relegation to the Championship at the end of the season? Any thoughts? I mean, that happens in some ways now. Roger in Sawbridgeworth in Hertfordshire says, haven't players brought this on themselves by increasing the amount of diving that goes on in the game? I was listening to 5 Live earlier on today, and they were talking there about the way that, or the hope that what it will do is change players' behaviour, which was laughed out of court immediately. And another one here as well on the same subject. This is Richard the Milkman. For 150 years, mistakes have been made by referees, and that's because they're human, like the players. In the past, it's just been part of the game. But now, with all the consequences of money and position in a lucrative league, it becomes not about the game, but just the money. And that's wrong. What's next? Giving players another chance when they tow it over the bar from 6 feet out? So that you've got 3 things there. You've got it's the referee's interpretation of events on the field that's the important thing. It's the players who've dived too much, and it's the referees who aren't good enough, and some of them need relegating to the Championship at the end of the season. Thoughts, Tim?
Well, I think obviously the main thing that we get out of this is don't mention the VAR. I think we mentioned it once, and I thought we got away with it, but we clearly hadn't. Because you just open up a box and it never, ever, ever ends. Referees getting assessed for their performances. This happens. I think that most of the refs in England are certainly better than the refs in South America, and they have to be, just because the football is so much quicker. The diving and so on. This actually, from my mind, this links a little bit to futsal. I was saying that futsal has replaced or taken some of the space of old-fashioned street football. In old-fashioned street football, you have to learn to defend yourself, which means learning when to get rid of the ball. In a sanitised environment, always in the presence of a referee, your defence mechanism becomes going to ground. Neymar is a futsal hot-housed player, and his first line of defence is going to ground. So that's something that I think about diving. And in terms, I did quite like that last point about referees' mistakes have always been part of the game, and to my mind, I think they always will be part of the game. And sometimes when I hear all these arguments about but there's so much money at stake, I end up thinking, well, perhaps there's too much money at stake, because at the end of the day, the purity of the activity is for me more important than the money that it generates.
Paul.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick up for the football league here. Why, if a referee is deemed to be not good enough at Premier League level, should he be lumped into the Championship? The Championship and Leagues 1 and 2 and even further down the line need the best referees possible. Now, look, technology has a place in football. Goal line technology has seamlessly been added to the game. It's an automated system. There's a chip in the ball, and the referee gets a confirmation on his wristwatch. It's not a watch, but it's around his wrist, and I can't think of what it's called. Look, I just think that
thingy. I think.
Yeah, the thingy on his wrist. I just think that referees will always make mistakes. That is correct. But when they are glaring mistakes, again, we've led in the news, in the sports news this evening on 5 Live, with the game this evening at Derby, between Derby County and Bristol City. Cameron Jerome came off the bench for his debut, was clearly fouled, went down in the box, should have been a game-winning penalty or a potentially game-winning penalty. Instead, he was booked for simulation. Now, the game has already stopped. The referee has gone to his pocket. He's reached for a yellow card. How long has that process taken? 45 seconds. A minute later on in the game, the Gary Bowyer was so incensed by what he'd seen, the referee took time to go over to the bench and warn the manager that if he continued his behaviour, he would be sent to the stands. Now, the game has already been interrupted. In that scenario, I have absolutely no problem with a video referee. Where it becomes, detrimental to the game is when we're artificially stopping the game, I think. And look, it was speaking about money in the game. I agree with you, Tim, that there is too much money in the game, but it is what it is, and there's not much that you or I can do about that. And we're constantly told every year at the end of May when the playoff finals come around, and it's the championship playoff final, it's the most lucrative game in world football, more so than winning the Premier League, more so than winning the World Cup, more so than winning the Champions League even. Now, both of these teams, I think Derby is second and Bristol City are in fourth place. That penalty for Derby County, that 3 points opposed to 1, that might be the difference between automatic promotion to the Premier League and losing in the playoffs. Now, for such a glaring error, I think that there should be a space for technology in football, but there has to be a very, very finite set of scenarios where this technology can be used. And it's worth mentioning every time this VAR debate comes up that they're not rules, they are laws, and these laws are open to interpretation. They're not hard and fast. There is an element of interpretation for referees, and as such, there will always be errors. It's minimising the glaring errors, such as the one this evening in that game in the Championship.
Good comment from Martin here in Luton, who says, if you're worried about players trying to influence the referee to go to the videos, this is easily stamped out. The system has been used in the Australian A-League for a while, and at the onset, if a player gesticulated for the ref to go to the video, that player was booked. The problem now seems to have been solved miraculously.
Well, of course, and that's the case with, when a player brandishes a fake yellow card, well, or it could be red. It's fake, so we don't know what colour it is. When there's a foul on the pitch, so the referee will immediately go to his pocket and book the player doing so. We've also had, not a change to the laws, because the laws have always prohibited trying to influence the referee. But the Premier League particularly have stamped down on this in the last couple of years, and you will see very, very infrequently now, after a decision is made, a penalty given or whatever, players surrounding the referee. This doesn't happen anywhere near as much as it used to. So, because it's new technology, teething problems, I don't think that there has been a real consideration of every potential scenario.
BBC 5 Live.